Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is going to be hopefully a very exciting session. I'm very excited to share some of the details of our latest release of Calico Enterprise 3.0. My name is Phil DiCorpo. I'm on the product management team here at Tigera, and I'm going to be walking you through some of this content. So before I get into some of the details of what we've delivered in the release, I wanted to spend a little bit of time and set some context about what Tigera does as a business, and particularly around some of the things that we do with Calico Enterprise. You may be familiar with Calico or open source CNI, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to kind of take a step back and talk about some of the things that we're doing with our commercial offering that's built around Calico. So, just at a high level, in terms of what Tigera does as a business and the value that we drive for customers, it's really sort of these, three things that you see at the top around providing security controls, being able to implement access controls and provide a platform for visibility and troubleshooting across your container platforms, and really doing that in a federated way so that you can have a consistent approach regardless of where you're running Kubernetes. So, at the foundation of everything that we do, as I mentioned, is Project Calico. So Project Calico is an open source project. It's maintained and developed here at Tigera, and it's been one of the most widely adopted networking implementations and network policy providers for Kubernetes. So it's used in hundreds and thousands of clusters around the world. And it's also the default out-of-the-box solution within every major cloud provider's hosted Kubernetes offering. So things like Amazon EKS, GKE, AKS, IKS, and it's also included in a lot of some of the most widely used distributions of Kubernetes, Docker Enterprise from Mirantis, Rancher, Canonical, just to name a few. So Calico Enterprise really builds on this kind of Calico core to really deliver on more advanced network security use cases and provide all the tools that you would need to take Calico and to help operationalize network security and compliance for your entire Kubernetes platform. So, from a policy perspective, that means helping our customers adopt best practices around zero trust and least privilege approach to network security. It also means enforcing policies at layer 3 and layer 4, things like TCP, UDP traffic, all the way up to layer 7, and doing things with DNS policies as well. So we're really kind of focused on, providing this unified policy model, this federated security model that can be sort of leveraged in the exact same way across your entire container platform, regardless of where it's run. And I'm really excited about some of the things that we're doing with a lot of these partners. I think it's an exciting time to be working in Kubernetes, and just some of the advances that some of our partners have made on their platforms, and some of the things that we're working on in the future is definitely exciting. The other thing to point out is, Calico as a CNI also supports the broadest range of data planes. So I think most of you are probably familiar with some of the things we do with standard Linux networking and IP tables, but we also support Windows as well. So if you have Windows workloads, we work with a number of customers that have invested heavily in things like the .NET framework. And so being able to support Windows workloads on your as part of your CAS platform and sort of leverage all the benefits of kind of cloud native methodology, that's something that Calico can support. And then most recently, we've added support for Linux eBPF as an entirely new data plane, leveraging some of the most advanced capabilities of the kernel, Really excited about what we're doing there, and some of the things that will come as a result of that data plane, and some of the new capabilities and things we'll be building in the future. If you would like to learn more about any of this, particularly eBPF, because I know that's of interest to a lot of the customers that I talk with, we have a fantastic blog up on projectcalico.org. It is not your average blog. It goes into a tremendous amount of depth and technical details to help you understand, some of the differences between maybe eBPF and some of the standard Linux networking. So I encourage you to check that out. So, just in terms of how we think about, Calico and Calico Enterprise, and it's really along, the what we call the enterprise Kubernetes journey. And this is something that we've tried to codify from, the many conversations that we've had with customers as they're working with either Calico open source or, trying to work through various phases of deploying Calico Enterprise. I think just by the very nature of you attending this call, it's likely that you're, on some stage of this journey, right? Whether it's in the early phases of just understanding Kubernetes, how things work, what the benefits will be for you, all the way to kind of beginning to stand up your own clusters, pilot different applications, before really, establishing a platform and moving, business critical applications up into Kubernetes. So, in terms of how we think about our roadmap and how we think about Calico Enterprise helping on that journey, for the very early stages, you might be already using Calico open source, and we do have something called Calico Essentials, which is really designed on helping you get the most out of Calico open source as you try, as you're working your way to production. And then, the other piece of this, as you get further along, that's where Calico Enterprise and some of the additional capabilities that we have within the product can really help you with some of these use cases that you see sort of over to the right. And there's sort of these 9 canonical use cases, but it's things like, and the 3 that you see here under stage 3 in bold are kind of the most frequently encountered, problems that we help solve for our customers. So things like enabling access controls for egress traffic. So inevitably, as you're standing up applications in clusters, those applications need to access resources somewhere else. It could be up in public cloud. It could be within some legacy infrastructure that you have within your environment that's behind a firewall. But those come with some unique challenges, just given the way that Kubernetes works. And there's some cool capabilities within Calico Enterprise to help with that. Visibility and troubleshooting is pretty huge. So, compared with Calico open source, one of the great benefits of Calico Enterprise, all the flow log data that has all of the Kubernetes context that you would need to help facilitate troubleshooting and understanding connectivity issues within your cluster. And then enterprise security controls, being able to take a lot of the things that maybe your security and compliance teams are already doing for traditional infrastructure and extend that to a Kubernetes platform. There's a lot of other stuff that's listed here. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these different use cases. We do have a Calico Enterprise trial that I'll talk about toward the end of the session, and just kind of give a quick plug for that if you want to learn more about some of these different use cases. But this is sort of how we think about our roadmap too, and how we're continually evolving the Calico Enterprise product offering is really just sort of advancing our capabilities around these 9 different canonical use cases. So as I talk about 3.0 and kind of what's new, there you'll see, there's some things that will clearly map to one of these 9 use cases. And there's other things that sort of cut across them as well. And this is just kind of, a little bit of a deeper dive on those three kind of, I think most frequently discussed use cases as it relates to Calico Enterprise. And really, it's taking Calico, all of the goodness of Calico, and helping you operationalize that within your environment. And really thinking about, these three things are really the most frequently kind of requested kind of capabilities and sort of problems that customers encounter around enterprise security controls, enforcing some access to endpoints outside the cluster, and then visibility and troubleshooting. This gives you sort of another view. This is particularly interesting maybe if you're already familiar with Project Calico, but this kind of gives you a little bit more of an itemized list of, some of the things that you get with Calico Enterprise above and beyond that Calico core. So some of the big things here that I'll just point out real quickly. Hierarchical network policy. So, we have a concept of tiers within Calico Enterprise. So you can define as many tiers as you'd like and assign policies to those tiers. Those tiers can be tied into your organizational hierarchy. So if you have like a platform team and a security team, each of those teams can define network security policies within those tiers. And the tiers sort of enforce order of precedence, and in which those policies will be evaluated before traffic is passed to the next tier. So it really, enables you as an operator to work with other stakeholders within your organization and define the guardrails for, what you want, your Kubernetes cluster to be able to do. As the platform, and sort of define some of the things that you want to be able to lock down, and that's going to be fairly unique to your business and your organization and kind of what you're doing. But that hierarchical network policy is something that is usually sort of front and center of a lot of Calico Enterprise deployments. We also do some cool stuff in sort of building on the flow log data that you get with Calico Enterprise. So it facilitates a lot of the troubleshooting visibility, but you can also then do cool things like, look at the network traffic patterns between two workloads and two endpoints, monitor that, and then automatically generate network policies or recommended policies from that flow log data. So, if you're really, thinking through how to go from, having a fairly open and very permissive cluster from a network policy perspective, and you want to enable application teams or different development teams to start building some of the more granular sort of zero trust, least privileged approach to network policy for east-west traffic within your cluster. Policy recommendations is designed to help you with that journey, and help enable teams who may not have a ton of Kubernetes domain expertise and they may not know the nuts and bolts of how to work with a network policy. This kind of gets them, started in a very quick way. They don't need to know all that stuff. They just need to be able to point to the intent of their application and have it run in a controlled environment, and we can automatically generate those policies. So some of this other stuff, there's just too much to kind of cover in the context of this session today, but this hopefully gives you a little bit better visibility into what you get with Calico and just how much more you get with Calico Enterprise. And a lot of this stuff is, I think, the things that we are finding tremendously valuable for our customers as they're really moving into migration of applications that are kind of business critical, and trying to operationalize that within their CAS platform. Okay, so now let's get into Calico 3.0. If you've been or Calico Enterprise 3.0, I'm sorry. So if you're familiar with Calico Enterprise, our last release was 2.8, so we did jump up to 3.0, and that's really to signify, the significance of multi-cluster management. So this is something we've been working on for a while. We've released it as a beta in prior releases, and it really represents an entirely new architecture and deployment option for our customers. We've gotten a lot of engagement and feedback from some of our existing customers on this new platform, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of that on the next slide. Egress gateways. This is another feature within 3.0 that's garnered a lot of interest. And this goes back to some of those canonical use cases I showed earlier, and be able to kind of implement effective access controls for egress traffic. So this solves a lot of really common challenges that our customers are running to when you have applications that need to access endpoints outside the cluster, and you need to be able to define rules effectively within control points like firewalls, or maybe you have monitoring tools that are looking at that traffic that need to be able to associate IPs with specific namespaces or applications running within cluster. And I'll go into more detail on that one. BGP, this is one of those things that I think is really kind of at the core of, how Calico works. And I think it's one of the things that a lot of, users in the Calico open source community love about Calico. Its ability to kind of create the flat pod network without encapsulation. But it also provides a lot of flexibility and facilities to peer into other parts of your infrastructure on-prem. And so we have customers who have some really complex topologies that they've put together for their Kubernetes clusters. And so we went and built out some additional capabilities for health and monitoring. So as there's different route propagation and peering happening, you have some visibility into how that's going, and you can proactively monitor and alert on issues that might result in a connectivity issue within the cluster. We also have expanded support for host endpoints. So host endpoint is essentially a custom resource that's part of Calico. It's also part of Calico Enterprise, and it sort of defines a resource of the host itself. And so, we can apply Calico network policies to pods running within the cluster, but we can also apply those same policies that leverage the same sort of label and declarative approach to hosts that are Kubernetes nodes, and also to hosts that are running outside the cluster as well. We call that use case microsegmentation. So some of the work that we did here was just to make sure that host protection and microsegmentation could be used with the Kubernetes API data store. So if you're using a managed Kubernetes service like EKS, that's really the only data store option you might have. So the host endpoint protection is compatible with that deployment scenario. And we also have done some things where if you're looking at protecting the control plane of Kubernetes and you're wanting to apply policies at a host level for your Kubernetes nodes, we've done some cool stuff within Calico so that we automatically create these host endpoints, and policies are applied to those host endpoints as you're auto-scaling your cluster. So this is a big request from a number of customers that we've been working with. I'm excited to sort of see some of the use cases that are built on top of that. We also added support for multi-NIC, and I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail in the session today, but effectively this allows for multi-homed pods operating on two completely different subnets. This is particularly important and of interest to Some of our customers who have extremely advanced Kubernetes clusters, they're, service providers, they're running sort of, streaming applications that require, one NIC is a fast data path, and another NIC is really facilitating some of the operations and management, reporting and things for the streaming application. If you're interested in that capability, it does require Multis. So, wherever you would be looking to run this, it would require compatibility with Multis as well. We're also doing some things around encryption. So, and this is initially part of our Calico open source release 3.14. It's effectively pod to pod, sort of on the wire encryption using WireGuard. So WireGuard is an encryption suite that is really sort of the next generation, and we really feel sort of the successor to IPsec in many ways. It just performs a lot better. So we've implemented encryption for Calico, as pods are communicating with each other, as that traffic leads a node, it automatically gets encrypted using WireGuard. And then finally, the other thing that we've been working on for some time, and this is also garnering quite a bit of interest, is Honeypods. So Honeypods, takes sort of the honeypot concept that's been around in the security space for some time, and really sort of adapts and sort of brings it into Kubernetes, and does some cool things in conjunction with Calico and Calico Enterprise to automatically detect some indication of compromise, potentially lateral movement, and we're doing some cool stuff there. I'll go into a little bit more detail. So that's sort of a broad overview. Some of the highlights within Calico Enterprise 3.0. This is based on the kind of the core, the data plane part of this release for Calico Enterprise 3.0 is 3.14. If there's more details and probably some smaller enhancements and features not covered here on a release note, so I encourage you to check that out as well. So now I'm going to go into just a little bit more detail on some of these capabilities, and the first is multi-cluster management. This is really, I think, definitely one of the kind of marquee features for 3.0, and it's essentially why we were calling it 3.0. Is just this is going to be a major new architecture and deployment option for Calico Enterprise. And effectively what it does is it allows you to really gain tremendous amount of operational efficiency and sort of minimize the footprint required for Calico Enterprise when you're running it across multiple clusters. And so what that means is, a lot of the flow log data that we generate within Calico Enterprise, there's sort of an LMA stack that's included, and we use Elastic, but it's built into Calico Enterprise. So instead of having to sort of, get resources and stand that LMA stack up into individual clusters, you're able to centralize a lot of that within a management cluster. So that becomes sort of the centralized management plane for Calico Enterprise. And then you can have other, what we call managed clusters joined into that deployment, and they become centrally managed. And so any log data that's generated within a managed cluster is sent up to the management cluster and stored in that LMA stack. You also, have a sort of a single source of authentication across all of your managed clusters through the management cluster. And there's also, centralized kind of UI. So that's one of the things that you get with Calico Enterprise is UI with a bunch of dashboards, a bunch of tools that facilitate troubleshooting and visibility in terms of how policies are being evaluated, which specific rules are allowing and denying traffic and getting that metrics. Really helpful to kind of understand how policies are working and where there's potential issues. So all of that stuff becomes centralized up in the management cluster with multi-cluster management. We're kind of really thinking about multi-cluster management and really sort of two halves of it. One half of it is all of the management capabilities of Calico Enterprise that are being centralized. So I already talked about the user interface and the LMA stack, but there's a ton of stuff that you're doing, potentially through Calico Enterprise that gets centralized in terms of, compliance reporting, getting visualization into how policies are being evaluated, centralized kind of alert definitions and be able to monitor on those alerts. So we have different types of logs within Calico Enterprise, audit logs, DNS logs, flow logs. So if you wanted to set up an alert that monitors any changes to a Calico network policy within a production environment and fire an alert if you see any of those changes, you can easily do that from a centralized location across multiple clusters. So pretty cool stuff. And I'm really, really excited about just all of the additional things we're going to be building on top of this platform. The other half of this is really around federation. So this is sort of where you have things like Calico and Kubernetes network policies defined once, and they're deployed and distributed across more than one cluster. So this is something that we have developed tech preview version of these federation capabilities that's supported for both Calico and Kubernetes network policies in addition to tiers. So the idea here is, if you have you want to set up those guardrails for your entire container platform, and you want to have a security tier, and maybe your security tier is really looking at things like PCI compliance or enforcing some type of regulatory concern. You might have a platform tier that is focused on controlling external access. So for any application that's running in my cluster, I've got a tier that's really focused on policies that are enabling access to maybe external APIs. It's leveraging things like DNS rules, anything that kind of defining what the cluster, any application on the cluster can do and can't do. And then you have a lower tier that might be implementing the network policies for east-west traffic between different microservices within your cluster. So for those higher precedent things like the security tier and the platform tier, that's something that I think we've heard from a lot of customers. Ideally, you'd like to federate that and have sort of a consistent definition that can be deployed across multiple clusters. That's something that this capability is looking to fulfill, and we also do that for. We have federation capabilities already today. This is not tech preview, but for endpoint identity. So if you want to federate things like labels, so that you can implement network policies for traffic that's going between clusters, you can do that as well. So for the network policy and policy tiers, the federation capabilities that we've built with 3.0 are in tech preview. More than happy to kind of set up a demo and show you what we've built. It does rely on KubeFed, which is sort of the upstream Kubernetes project that is focused on federation. We're monitoring the health of that project to sort of see if that's going to be the right implementation for our needs. And so that, that is somewhat subject to change, but really excited about what we've built thus far and always looking for feedback. Okay, so egress gateways. So this, we've worked with a lot of customers where they have fairly difficult challenge where they have applications that need to access external resources, but they're in a little bit of a pickle in terms of how they can implement rules and enforce policies on who can access those external resources in control points like firewalls. So I might be an application within the cluster that needs to access some type of relational database. That database is sort of sitting in an entirely different zone that's sitting behind some firewalls. The network security team has a policy of enforcing rules on who can access that relational database. So how can you work effectively, given that Kubernetes, it's very dynamic, it's very ephemeral in terms of how IPs are created and assigned. So Egress Gateways really helps to solve some of those challenges and provide sort of a reliable way to identify traffic outside the cluster and associate that with specific namespace or application. And the way that works is that you have your cluster CIDR that might be a bunch of private IP range. Egress Gateways allows you to define an egress IP pool that could be outside the pod CIDR. So that could be a set of routable IPs. It could be something very small like a /30 or /28. And you can then associate that egress IP pool with some gateways. And those gateways can be assigned to specific pods, or it can be assigned to a namespace. And it's done very simply through an annotation. So what happens when any pod that exists that's tagged for an egress gateway, or maybe a pod that is within a namespace that's tagged for egress gateway, when it is trying to communicate outside the cluster, Calico is smart enough to recognize that and will selectively do some encapsulation to route that traffic to the egress gateway pod. And then the SNAT happens on the egress gateway pad, and you get an IP within the range of your egress IP pool. So you can then go to your network security team who's defining your firewall rules and say, hey, here's my, here's the egress IP range for this application. And so you need to enable access to some external resource like a relational database. So this solves a huge problem for a number of our customers. Most common use case I would say is firewalls and other types of control points. But we've also talked with customers where they're seeing traffic flows outside the cluster that's getting maybe dumped into a SIM or some type of data lake, and they want to be able to reliably associate certain IPs with applications within Kubernetes, and this enables that. Okay. Next up, BGP Health and Monitoring. So, as I mentioned earlier, BGP is really at the core kind of how Calico works. And it enables some really kind of cool topologies in terms of, the peering that's happening, not just within your cluster, but how you're able to kind of peer into various forms of on-prem infrastructure that you might have, top of rack switches and things like that. So, I think one of the challenges that we had heard from customers is just having the visibility into how this BGP peering and route propagation is happening. And so we really kind of did three things in 3.0 to address some of those concerns. So one is within Calico node, there's an entirely new endpoint that's built into it to scrape metrics, and that's sent into Prometheus. So part of Calico Enterprise, you get not just the LMA stack I mentioned earlier, but also an instance of Prometheus, and we scrape a bunch of metrics that help you monitor operations of Calico. This is yet another set of metrics that's been added to that list. so that if you want to be proactive and sort of alert on some of how the BGP peering and route propagation is happening within your cluster, you can easily do that. We're also generating logs. So as states are changing within the individual nodes and routers within your fabric, we're sending logs from those nodes back to Elasticsearch. So that gives you sort of the historical view of how things have changed over time. So if you're troubling, trying to root cause why you had like 20 minutes of downtime in your cluster and it happened, 2 hours ago, you have, this historical view into how things have changed, and it helps kind of provide that more forensic and investigative sort of use case. And then finally, command line tools. So if you want to be able to kind of go and easily from a centralized location, be able to go introspect the current state of BGP and the router that's on an individual node within your cluster, you can more easily do that. So a lot of this stuff like the logs and the command line tools, if you're a Calico open source user, you are probably already familiar with the fact that it requires you to go access an individual node to do all that stuff. So so both the command line tool, logs, it's centralized, so you can just do it from a centralized location. That the command line tool is in fact a kubectl plugin. So it's very streamlined in terms of being able to get at this information, quickly kind of understand the state of things to help diagnose any sort of issues that might be having related to BGP. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover here was some of the work that we're doing with Honeypods. So Honeypods, it really is taking the honeypot concept and extending it to Kubernetes. So effectively what that means is, honeypods are really just a configurable, highly configurable Kubernetes deployment, as masquerading as some type of vulnerable exposed service. So it could be, some sort of Nginx based service. It could be MySQL. I think we have a couple of flavors that we've put together for this tech preview. And you have a lot of control in terms of how that then gets deployed in your cluster, and what namespaces it's running in. But effectively what happens is these things just exist within your cluster and monitors and alerts on any network activity with the honeypod. So anything that's trying to access it presumably shouldn't be accessing it. And so therefore we, monitor alert, we provide a set of dashboards specifically for honeypod deployments. So you have visibility into if anything, if some pod within your cluster is compromised and is attempting lateral movement, it hits one of these honeypods. It's effectively a tripwire that lets you know that there's something worth taking a closer look at within your cluster. We also, in the latest iteration of this, have added our first foray into deep packet inspection. So we're not just looking at the network activity, we're doing some packet capture. We've incorporated a Snort engine and a ton of community-based signatures so that we can look at the contents of those packets and alert on things that may be indicative of sort of well-known exploits and malware. So this is really, kind of exciting. Obviously, it's not meant to be a substitute for all of the other things that we do within Calico and Calico Enterprise in terms of network security and adopting sort of a zero trust model. But this is absolutely, I think, a great tool to really develop a defense in depth strategy for securing your Kubernetes platform. So just, kind of a quick plug for some of the upcoming events. That's all I had for kind of the Calico Enterprise 3.0 release, and I think we'll open it up here for questions real quickly, but just a kind of a quick plug on some of the things that we have on the calendar as we head into June. Troubleshooting, microservice connectivity. I think I sort of alluded to a lot of the visibility that you get with Calico Enterprise, and I think that session will go into a lot more detail. We've done some work recently to have the Calico CNI work with EKS, and that's becoming quite a common request from customers who want to understand how to do that. And then, talking about ingress and getting into some of the specifics of host microsegmentation on Azure. So really cool to kind of keep these events going. And then finally, one thing that is near and dear to my heart is Calico Enterprise Trials. So this is up on our website. There's the URL. And effectively what this is, it's a 7-day trial. You go, you sign up, it's, very simple form. And we provision you your own cluster. You get to choose what platform. If you really want it to be OpenShift, you can choose OpenShift. If you want it to be AKS, it could be AKS. And then we have a set of labs that you can walk through that are sort of built into that cluster. So if you want to get hands-on and really understand a lot of this stuff by just kind of working with the product, this is a great way to do it. And it's very lightweight in terms of the process to get one of these clusters provisioned. So I highly encourage you to check this out. So that's all I had in terms of content, and looks like we've got about 15 minutes left if we want to open it for questions.